Welcome back to Build a Mobile App in 2 hours. In this session, we'd like to create the trip details screen and store the data that's been collected. So here we can see the space trip details, and the new details screen will require an input variable for the local space trip ID. And this ID will come from the Select Planet screen. We'll also need to retrieve all of the planets for the trip. And to do this, we'll be filtering our space trip planets by their space trip ID. And from there, we'll be able to use what's retrieved to create a list to display the planets that will be visited. And we'd like to display the image, the name, the system, and the coordinates. So we get something that looks like this. Now, to be able to get all of this to work, we are going to have to go back and update the new trip screen and the selected planet screen so that they store the data that they've been collecting. The new trip screen got the space trip, and the selected planets created the space trip planets data. So, lots to do. Let's go ahead and get started. To create the new space trip details screen, let's go to the Interface tab. We'll scroll up to the new Space Trip Wizard UI flow, and we'll add the final screen to it. And the final screen here's name will be Space Trip Details. Let's make that look good. Okay, so we have our Space Trip Details screen, and we need an input parameter. So when we're coming from selected planets, we need to know what is the local space trip ID that we're working with. So here we can see the local space trip identifier has been added. We'd also like to get some data, and in this case, we'll fetch data from local storage. And when we fetch the data, we want to grab things for the local space trip. And in this case, what we need from the local space trip is a filter to say we want the information for the local space trip if the local space trip ID that we've been given is equal to the local space trip that we're searching for here. So this will return to us one space trip with a name, departure date, etc. And if we go back, now we can use this for our space trip details, because we'll have a local space trip inside of it, and that will have a name. So we'd like the name of this screen to be the name of the trip that we've been creating. And then we'd like, under that, to have all of the planets listed that we selected to go ahead and travel to. So we have what we need here. Now what we'd like to do is grab another. So in our space trip details, we could use another fetch data from local storage aggregate. And in this case, we're trying to get the planets. So I'd like the local space trip planet. And if we expand some of the hidden pieces, we know that we're going to have the space trip ID, and we'll have a planet ID. Now, even though we're going to know the planet, what we do want is to make sure that we can describe the planet, see its image. So we'll add another source, and that's going to have to be the local planet. And we're going to filter these and make sure that when we're looking for these, we want the local space trip planet. It has a space trip ID. We would like that space trip ID to be the same as the one that was just passed in. And in this case, I've unfortunately put them right next to each other, and I should have had an equals in between. Good. Now, because we've done this, we did a local space trip planet, and it's filtering them by space trip ID. Let's edit this, and I'm going to delete what's currently there, and I'm just going to call this get local planets. And now we'll go back to the screen, and inside of get local planets, I have information about the planets and information about the space trip planets. So I want to show the list of planets to get a list, I come to the toolbox, drag and drop the list, and it wants to know what data we're going to put there. And we just spent a good bit of time making sure that we could get the local planets associated with our trip with this aggregates query that joins this good info. And in this case, I'd like the local planet to be what we're going to display. And you can see that it immediately grabs its image, it looks for the name, the description, the system, and the coordinates. So all of that looks pretty nice. Now we'd like to make this look a little better, so if we started with something like the system is pretty large there. We might want to sort of fade this into the background. So we can give that a style, and we'll just call this text, and we'll say it's gray. And now you can see it kind of falls into the background a little bit. Same thing for the coordinates. Right now they're very large. Let's change that to a style class that's already been defined, something like text, and there's a text notes. How about a note? And now you can see it gets very small and gray and hides into the background. So we also have the description, which takes up a lot of space. And in this case, we've already gone through all the planets. So we just need to be reminded of maybe the name and the system. And since we have the picture, the name, and the system, that's probably good enough. So what we've done is added the right variables and brought back the right local storage data to go ahead and define everything that needs to be in our screen. Now there's still a set of data coming from the previous screens. So if we go back one screen, we would have been in the Select Planets screen. And in the Select Planets screen, in this case, we are going to be moving from the Select Planets into the Book Trip. So we're going to get to being able to see this when we wish to book the actual trip. So if I enter into the Book Trip on click, what we can see is that this was going to the home screen. And we no longer need this to go to the home screen. We would like this now to actually go to our SpaceTripDetails. And for this to work, it needs a local SpaceTrip ID, and it's already bringing that in as an input. So we'll just have it pass it along to us in the next screen. Now, this gets us what we need as far as the trip information getting to the next screen. We also need to store the list of planets that were selected. So to be able to do that, we're going to need a new variable. So we'll go to Select Planets, and we'll ask it for a local variable. And in this case, we want it to be the local space trip planet. And that local space trip planet will now give us the opportunity to save information about one of these. So the way we're going to do this is when we now are trying to basically book this trip, we've already selected a list of planets. So we're going to grab a for each from the action toolbar, and we'll put the for each in here, and it says, what is your record list? And we already have the list of selected planets because we created a variable to hold that. We're then going to take that list of planets and we'll assign, if I drag it down there, we're going to go ahead and assign that to the new variable that we just created. And then what we'd like to do is store it in local storage. So here I'm going to drop a run client action, and this is another way of getting to some of our data. I can scroll to the bottom under entities, see that local storage is here, and in this particular case we're trying to store a local space trip planet. If I open that, I can select the create, and now I can actually link all of these together, which will create this for each loop. So now all of this is set, and this is the only one that's unhappy because it wants the source of the data. We need to assign the source of the data to start. So the first thing we're going to do is in our local space trip, which is our new variable, we're going to say that the space trip ID will be set up, and this needs to be the input that was the local space trip ID to the screen. So we can just select that one and be done. Second, we need to make sure we have the right planet ID. And in this case, to get the planet, we're going to be looking at the selected planets, and the selected planet has a current, so which one is active at the moment in the list that we're looking at, and that will give us the ID we need. And then last but not least, we may want to manipulate the order, and this is a little strange, but we're going to do the same thing. We're going to look at the selected planets, and we know what its current row number is. But what we can see here to the right is that it's a zero-based index. So to know exactly what order that this planet should be in, we're going to give it the current row number, and then we're going to add 1. Because we want it to know, is it the first one, is it the 7th one? There really is no 0 in a list like that. So we'll click Done. And now, when we go to create the local space trip planet, the source is going to be the new variable of the local space trip planet. And once the loop finishes, now we're going to be able to call the space trip detail. Now, originally we were just going to give it the space trip details, and it needed a space trip identifier. So that space trip identifier is the one that is coming in, and this is actually coming from the previous page. So we have to make sure that we saved everything correctly on the new trip screen. So let's go back to the new trip screen. And here in the new trip screen, when we continue to the select planets, is where we'll store our information. So I can go to continue to select planets on click. It is validating the form, and I'm going to drag this down a little bit. And I'm going to use the same trick again. I'm going to grab a client action, but I'm really going to use a data client action. And what we want to do here is be able to, we've been defining a space trip, so we want to create the local space trip. It needs information about the trip as far as its source, and we already have a local variable for that. And now the new space trip wizard had been passing along the local space trip ID that was part of the variable. But the database is going to create a new space trip ID. So we shouldn't use the variable here. What we want to use is the create local space trip ID, because that's what's coming back from local storage. So this is good. At this point, we can go ahead and check this out and see how it works. So let's click the one-click publish button. And we'll go to the browser and test it out in the emulator. So the app's been updated. We are now inside of our app, and we can go ahead and create a new event. So let's call this our trip to Mars. We'll leave on the 24th, come back on the 27th. We'll continue to our selected planets. Let's choose the first 3. We'll throw a couple away. And now we have about 8 or 9 planets. So let's book this trip. And now we see that we have our trip to Mars. And if I scroll down, I have my 9 or 10 planets. So this looks really good. We've been able to create the trip detail screen with all of the information that it needs. Join me in the next session where we're going to make sure that these can be accessed from the dashboard. So we'll update the dashboard to make sure it can give us all the information about our trips.